Thank you very much for having me, and thanks to Massimiliano for paving the way for my intervention. In terms of case studies, I'm going to talk about Algeria and Syria, just to demonstrate some of the points that Massimiliano made. Throughout yesterday's presentations, we've discussed about several larger aspects, such as the role of privatization in the renegotiation of relations between state and private sector happening in Europe. And of course, this is something that happened also in the Middle East and North Africa. It just happened in a more, I would say, more authoritarian framework. But really, the privatization were the occasion for the renewal of state power through the economy, particularly as we look at economies that are mainly are also working through rentier networks in order to assert their pressure. So we can really, from the very beginning, answer to the question that was posed by this conference about privatization as a way for the state to withdraw from the economy. This is not the case at all in the Middle East and North Africa. The state is just withdrawing from certain areas, but actually it maintains its own leverages, its own traditional leverages, not intact, but they're still there. They're very important. At the same time, there are also other new channels to exert rentier leverages. So when we talk about privatization in the Middle East and North Africa, we can really say that the state is continuing to functioning just under disguise in some ways. Another very important point that links my case studies to the general framework is that of the advent of neoliberalism, of course, as a change of paradigms in how economy is conceived. And a very important point that we should highlight when we talk about the neoliberal integration of the Middle East and North Africa into the global economy is that actually the elite in those countries that are often described as being passive or subaltern to, of course, European and Western pressure actually grasped these paradigms and were able to control them in order to renew their power in a phase that was very critical, both politically and economically. And so it really drives us to understand the advent of neoliberalism and the elaboration of neoliberal economies, not just as a European or a Western process, but really as a global one, where elites in the so-called periphery actually contributed directly to how this paradigm were actually globalized. And also, again, this understanding of those paradigms was fundamental because it lent to these elites some leverages that would be clear and play a clear role in order to rebalance a relation that in the context of debt negotiation, which were the main entry point of privatization request, of course played an important role, and rebalancing this relation and allowing these elites to again control this process. So I prepared a few slides, but they're just photos of gentlemen that had a role in privatization, just to, because I'm quoting a few names, so just to make clear who they are. So first of all, an important thing that we should consider when talking about liberalization and privatization in the Middle East and North Africa is that they started autonomously. They did not start when this state went through IMF and World Bank program or programs supported by the European institutions. And the clear cases are those of Egypt, for instance, with the so-called phase of the Infitah, which it's Arabic for opening, which already started in the 1970s in order to respond to the problematic aspect emerging from state-led development, or those of Algeria after the death of President Houari Boumediene and the rise to power of Chadli Benjedid in 1978. In 1980, Chadli Benjedid launched a program called For a Better Life, which was aimed at actually opening up the economy, bringing into the Algerian economy some, again, neoliberal paradigms, such as a new managerial style of running state-owned enterprises, breaking down state and shrinking big state-owned enterprises, liberalizing imports, and trying to spur economic growth through consumption. So this is important because when actually after the 1986 oil counter-shock and all of the role that this had in sparking that crisis that would lead to the first relations between local countries and the international financial institutions, actually the first IMF, World Bank, and European program in economic reform were granted almost with little or no conditionalities, just in recognition of what had been done already. And this is the case of Algeria in 1988 and 1990. The IMF, the European Commission, the World Bank were all very much enthusiastic about seeing a country which was perceived as being formerly socialist, turning to neoliberal economy before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So again, the political dimension is very important. Politics really is central in making a country credit-worthy, not just reform. Then, of course, Algeria went through a phase of. We also talked yesterday of the rise in European countries of technocrats who had a neoliberal North American academic background. This happened also in the Middle East and North Africa. Here we see Chadli Benjedid with two of the most important members of a technocratic government that rose to power in 1988, Mouloud Hamrouche and Sid Ahmed Ghazali. And others, all these people and others had a North American or European background. But they were, unlike their European counterparts, they knew how state power worked in their own countries, and they did not want to actually abolish the state or shrink the state. They wanted to use the state to either pursue what they see as a progressive modernization of the economy along neoliberal line, or just they wanted to maintain authoritarian control. Of course, despite these efforts to modernize the economy in Algeria, the economic crisis went along with the political crisis because Algeria tried to liberalize in 1988, but the rise in popularity of an Islamist party, the Front Islamique du Salut, actually, and their first victory in the parliamentary election, of course, meant that the traditional elite would have to leave power to this new formation, something that, of course, the military bureaucratic elite was not ready to do. And so, after the first ever free parliamentary election, the first round, styled along the French model, these elections were cancelled in 1992, and this would lead to a 10-year civil war between jihadist insurgents and the so-called and the state army. Here we see the so-called on my left, your right, the so-called Janvieristes, those who made the coup d'état in 1992, and Mohamed Boudiaf, who became president of Algeria before being assassinated, was used as a charismatic figure in order to create consensus behind this military coup. The situation, of course, led to the worsening of the economic situation, and it was impossible to avoid rescheduling with the major creditors. Rescheduling happened in 1994 and 1995, and one would accept that major structural reform would arrive, especially as Algeria signed economic structural agreement with the IMF and the World Bank. But the Algerian elite, in the middle of a war, in the middle of a societal meltdown, were able actually to control privatization, actually because also of the war, which really also speaks volume of the ability of Western experts to evaluate the situation. I mean, after all, it may seem naive, but how can you imagine of carrying out structural adjustment in a country at war when you cannot really monitor what is happening? But the Algerian elite actually managed to create a strategy in order to maintain the control over these adjustment process. I talked about grasping paradigms, And the Algerian elite grasped that the main priority for creditors was the stabilization of the macroeconomic situation of the country. So the main goal was securing the fact that Algeria would service its debt regularly. So the different governments over the 1990s actually respected the macroeconomic conditionalities and stabilized the external situation of the country quite easily and quickly. Okay, well, I'm lagging far behind, so I should speed up. But they slow down on actual structural reforms. For instance, when it came to privatization, they would just mainly focus on the legal framework, preparing the ground, but not carrying out actual privatization. At the same time, they exploited the fact that there was no distinction in the IMF, World Bank, and European programs between privatization and liquidation. So they simply liquidated non-strategic state-owned enterprises. So they met actually the conditionalities of the IMF without privatizing, for instance, strategic areas of the economy, such as the hydrocarbon. And also, they also linked political issues to economic, of course, crisis. The Algerian government managed to obtain recognition by the IMF and the World Bank and other European countries, saying that the economic settlement of the Algerian crisis was linked to the political settlement program as conceived by the Algerian authorities. So Europe and Western countries supported the Algerian regime in a civil war, and they managed to dilute reforms until hydrocarbon rents became available again in the early 2000s, and so there was no need to have a relation with the international financial institutions. Now, I will briefly say something about Syria, where again, liberalization is a way to respond to the changes in the economic situation, but again, the link between political issues and economic reforms is very close. Syria went through a pressure to liberalize in the 1980s because the sources of its traditional rent were declining. Syria supported Iran in the Iran-Iraq war, and so Gulf money started to shrink. So they needed to attract new sources of rents from expatriates, from remittances. But at the same time, also European rents started to, and aid started to shrink because of the alleged involvement of Syria into international terrorist actions. But for instance, when it came to the European decision to block financing to Syria, actually the Assad regime managed to I'm going to close to support to exploit its relation with France, as the French diplomacy said, you know, we cannot block assistance to Syria because they're not repaying their debt, and we cannot really ask them to privatize because we need a relation to Syria to have an influence in Lebanon, in Palestine, and in the Gulf. And this actually worked because the European financing was blocked just for a year, and in 1987 it was again made available. So again, I would have more to say, but I think it'd be better if I close here, and maybe we'll have time to say something more later. Thank you very much.